Hi, everybody. Okay, so this is your perception review. Alrighty, so perception is different than sensation in the sense that we all perceive things differently, whereas sensation, we might have similar sensations. Like if we eat something that is sour, most of us can sensationally interpret that as being sour, whereas perception is going to be different for all of us because whether or not we think the sourness of a lemon is delicious or not is going to be everyone's different perceptions. So, perception is how we select, organize, and interpret sensory information, which then enables us to recognize meaningful objects and events. Again, another example can be if someone walks in the room, our perception of whether or not that person is attractive is going to be different from all of us. We're going to select things differently, we're going to organize things differently, and we're going to interpret it differently as well. Okay, so selective attention is basically where you put your focus. And so this, remember, it's called the Necker cube. Depending where you pay attention to the cube, you should be able to kind of move the cube in different ways. And so one way to look at it is like if you're going to see one way as it popping forward, it can be this way. So this is the top of the cube. This is, again, difficult doing this. Okay, so then this part is going to pop forward. But if you pay attention to a different part, then you can see, sorry, I have to now, okay. You can see this part being the front of the cube. Okay, so that's the cube. You do that like that. So then you're able to then manipulate the cube forward and backwards depending on where you are putting your attention. So that's called the Necker cube. And we also talked about how selective attention is a person's focus on a consciousness on a particular stimulus. We also talked about this in our consciousness chapter. And a lot of times selective, attention is good for self-regulation. So let's say sometimes we're upset and we're driving. Those of us that can focus our attention on still getting ourselves safely home instead of whatever issue is making us feel upset, that would be also another example of selective attention. Okay, then remember this whole thing, we showed you the video of the moonwalking bear. And so some of us weren't able to see it because you were too focused on the passing of the basketballs. So it was like 4 men in white and then 4 men in black, and they were passing the basketballs back and forth. And some of you guys were able to see it, some of you guys weren't. And if you were to miss it, then this would be called inattentional blindness. Oh, it's right here. Haha. Okay, it's where we're unable to see something that's in our midst because we're focused on something else. Okay, then we talked about this one, which was change blindness. Remember the whole experiment where someone's going to ask you for directions, and then in the middle, someone came by with a painting, and then the person that was originally asking for directions changed to a completely different person, whether it was the same gender or a different ethnicity, and yada yada. And the person here was so focused on giving direction that they completely missed the change within the environment. So that would be called change blindness. Alrighty, then anytime we're talking about our 5 senses, out of all of them, which ones dominate? And the one that dominates the most is going to be vision, and that whole idea is called visual capture. And remember, we showed you, well, we as in me, showed you the video of the guy going, you know, ba, 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 fa, fa, fa. And depending what you were seeing and how the mouth was moving, it would then change the way you were hearing it, even though it was the exact same word that he kept saying over and over again. And so that whole idea was called the McGurk effect. So McGurk. Okay. I think that's how you spell it. Okay. And so the McGurk effect is an example of visual capture because our vision is going to beat out our other senses. Another example of visual capture is going to be if you're sitting in your car and it's parked and the car next to you is parked, but then the other car starts to move and then you think your car is moving, then that's also visual capture. That can also happen in a train station as well, or if you're like at an amusement park and there's 2, rows of, I don't know what they're called, carts, and if one cart moves and you think you're moving, then that's going to be visual capture. So the person in charge of the whole idea of sensation perception is going to be your Gestalt psychologist, and their famous quote is this, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. meaning that if we look at a computer, we know that different parts make up the computer. And so if I have a computer here and then a computer that's completely disassembled, when we look at a computer, we mostly see the whole, even though we know the parts make up the whole. And so our brains like to focus on the big picture, like the whole system, rather than all the little parts of it that make up the system. So that is what this quote means. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's Gestalt. Okay. Oh, here's your Madrid effect. Remember the whole
At any one moment, we are being bombarded.
We don't have to watch it again. Okay, now form perception. So if you see the little men first versus the arrows or back and forth, depending which one sticks out to you, it's going to be your figure and then your ground. So if you see the little people, then the black is going to be your figure, and then the white space behind you is going to be your ground. Another example could be when you're looking at the clouds, or the sky. If you see images in the clouds, your clouds are going to be your figure, and then the sky is going to be your ground. Another FRQ example they've done before is like at an assembly. So if we're watching the assembly, the gym floor is going to be your ground, but then all your dancers and your performers are going to be the figure. Or let's say we were to take a class picture and you guys wanted to spell out 2020. Excuse me. You can have everybody in the background, like the whole senior class, be wearing blue. And then you can have certain seniors wear yellow and then have it spell out 2020. And so the background would be your ground, and then the 2020 would be your figure. Sorry. Okay, then you have your Gestalt groupings. So we like to organize things. Our brain doesn't like things when it's disorganized. And so when you're looking at this, because they are near each other, this is going to be called proximity. So in my classroom, our groupings would probably be in groups of 4 because I have 4 sections of 2 rows together, 2 rows, 2 rows, 2 rows. And so if you're close together, then that's called proximity. Okay, this one, most of us are going to see this as a row of triangles, a row of circles, a row of triangles, rather than triangle, circle, triangle. Excuse me. And that is going to be called similarity. We see things that are similar to be grouped together. It's also why we have cliques sometimes, because a certain type of person looks the same as everybody else, or they're all wearing the same thing. So like maybe our athletes, maybe our basketball players are all going to wear the same warm-ups. So then we can quickly go, okay, those are the basketball players because they're all grouped together because they're similar. Okay, this one we're going to see most of it as a straight line through or a continuous squiggle rather than a half moon, half moon, half moon, half moon, because we, as our brains, we want things to be continuous. So either straight through or all the way through this way. Okay, we are going to see usually couples. We normally can tell when things are grouped together because they are connected. So we have proximity, similarity, continuity, and connectedness. And then there was one other one, which is this one. This is a bad image, but most of us probably would see this image as a triangle, even though it's not actually a triangle. They're just floating black markings, but our brain wants to make it make sense, so then we close it. So law of closure is also a Gestalt principle. Okay, so then we have, remember this, we have depth perception. The person in charge of this was Gibson. Okay, so Gibson basically said that children start developing depth perception around 6 months, around crawling age, and this whole apparatus is called the visual cliff. Okay, now here's all your binocular cues. So binocular basically means you have to use 2 eyes. So this was kind of the floating sausage. If we were to do this, you should be able to see a floating finger right here. So it's a floating sausage finger trick. It's where 2 eyes are going to differ, so that is called retinal disparity. There's a disparity in what your retinas are going to basically see. Okay, this one, when it comes to a point, this is called convergence, and so as it basically is going to go inwards. Okay, this one, so we talked about this. This is, I think, I'm pretty sure I sent you guys outside and you guys had to find all these different monocular cues. So monocular cues are what a lot of artists are going to do to give you the false perception of depth. So it's very much like a painting or a drawing. A lot of the posters we have around our school and my classroom, even a lot of the things like even in my shirt. So yay, Valencia. Sometimes it might pop out. So even though it's a flat surface, depending on how it's designed, it's going to have a monocular cue that's give us a false perception of depth. So when you're looking at these two pencils, the smaller one appears to be farther away, even though we know they're the same distance. And so that whole idea is called relative size. Whichever one casts a smaller image in our retinas is going to appear to be farther away, even though it's the same distance. Okay, then this one, we have the two circles like blocking each other. I don't think I have it on my shirt. I don't. But when you're looking at the two circles, it appears that the, I almost said orange. It's not orange. Green circle is closer to us because it looks like as though it's blocking the black circle, but really we know it's the same distance. And so that whole idea is called interposition. So it's going to block one on top of each other. So it's going to give us the false perception of depth. Okay, and then we have this one. So things that are hazy are going to appear to be farther away. So these circles back here appear to be farther from us than the ones in the front, even though we know it's equal distance. Another example we talked about was fog. So driving in fog can be really dangerous because we misread how far and how distant the car in front of us will be because it's fuzzy. And so that whole idea is called relative clarity. Okay, then this one, things that have more gradient, more texture, more fine details are going to appear to be closer to us in a painting, and that idea is called texture gradient. So the more gritty detail, the more it's going to appear to be closer. Okay, this one, if I was to flip this around, we did this in class. So the white space almost appears to be farther than the black space. Because things that are higher in our visual field is going to appear to be farther away. So the white space is higher for us in our visual field versus the black space, so the white is going to appear to be farther, and that's called relative height. Okay, this is where the moon follows us or the mountains follow us. It's like, ooh, yay, I'm so special. The moon's like following with me. That whole idea is going to be called relative motion. So things that are closer to us, so like if we're driving and we have the markers or like the, what is it called? The railing, if it's closer to us, it's going to go faster, but it's going to go in the opposite direction. So it's going to swish past us. But things that are farther away, like the moon or the mountains, are going to move with us, but slower and in the same direction. So that's relative motion. Another word for that I've seen too is called motion and parallax. So the both words mean the same. I just don't know what the test is going to use, but I've just seen it two different ways in different books. Okay, then this one is like Art 101. Usually this is kind of like the first thing you learn how to draw. And this whole idea is called linear perspective because it's using the idea of convergence to then give us this false sense of depth, as if we can like walk into the painting, even though obviously we can't. Okay, then this is basically as you walk closer to an object, it's going to increase in size. As you walk back from an object, it's going to decrease in size. But is it actually decreasing and increasing? No, but that whole idea is called motion perception. So objects traveling towards us grow in size, and those moving away from us are going to become smaller, even though it's not changing shape. Okay, this is where we go to like a baseball game or a football game or anything, and they have the lights around the stadium, or even in front of our school, we have the marquee that says like, oh, Valencia, or, you know, spring break or school closures, and it looks like it's like moving, even though it's not. That whole idea is called the Phi phenomenon. It's basically behind the scoreboard are all these lights, and they're just turning on and off really rapidly, so it gives us the false perception of movement, and that is Phi phenomenon. Okay, then this one, this is where if I just stare at a stationary point, my eyes make it move. Or like, let's say you're sleeping at night and you like look at something in your room and you're like, oh my gosh, it moved. Did it really move? No. But if we stare at something long enough, we can make it move with our eyes, which is called autokinetic effect. And then this one is pretty much like a flip book or like old school. I don't know how they make movies nowadays, but back in the old days, they used to have like a film strip of all these little images. And if you were to rapidly spin them, then it would give us the false perception of movement, which is how we get our movies. Or a flip book, you can have like a flip book, and then if you have a different image on each page and then you flip it really rapidly, it would make that image give us the sense that it's moving even though it's not. And that's called stroboscopic motion. Okay, then size constancy, these are all like your concepts. So if I walk towards my Toyota Camry and it's parked right here outside my house, it's going to appear pretty large. But if I'm looking at it from a distance, it's going to appear really small. But is my Toyota Camry actually changing shape? No. Or changing size? No. So that whole idea is going to be called size constancy. Okay, this one, remember we have the little monsters. So when you're looking at it, it looks as though this monster and this monster are different sizes. Most people think that this monster is bigger. But if you were actually to pull out the two monsters, these two monsters are actually the exact same size. But because they're using, the convergence and linear perspective, the one in the back is going to appear to be larger even though it's not. Same thing with this image. And so that is called the Ponzo effect. Okay, another one that we went over, but it's not in the PowerPoint, is, do you guys remember what this is called? Hopefully I can draw it. Remember the two arrows? Okay, that's like terrible. But usually if we're to look at the two arrows, we would say, oh, which one do you think is longer, or, yada, yada, and really they're the same length. But because the arrows are either going this way or outwards, it gives us the false perception that one is longer than the other, but it's not. And this one was called the Mueller-Lyer effect. Remember? I wish I could spell it. Mueller. Okay, Liar. Liar. There we go. And then I think it had like the two dots above the U. Okay, so it's Mueller-Lyer and Ponzo effect. Okay, remember this was the kind of one that was very similar to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And so it's kind of weird, like, how in the world is this little girl so small here and then she's giant here, and then vice versa. But really what's happening is that it's actually bent inwards. So it gives us the false perception that they are the same distance from us, but really this person here and this person here is actually at an angle. So that whole perception is called the Ames room. Okay, and then color constancy, this again is another duh word. I think the example I gave you guys was my nail polish. So I can pick a nail polish at the salon, even though right now I can't go to the salon because we're all quarantined. So my nails look terrible. But if I'm in the salon, I pick my color and I'm like, ooh, I like it. But then when I go outside in the sun, it's like a different color. And then if I go to my bathroom at home, it's different. And if I go to school, it's different. And so the changes of color, my perception of the color is changing. But is the nail polish color actually changing? No. So that whole idea is called color constancy, that we can perceive it to change, but really it stays the same. But it's all about the context. Okay, so here are all your monocular cues. It's good to be able to see these in your everyday lives. It's everywhere, and like all the posters on a lot of your outfits. It's everywhere. So being able to point them out is good. Okay, then perceptual adaptation was the goggles, that our eyesights and our brain are really awesome, that if we wear, the 60 degrees off angle goggles or the upside down goggles, that eventually at some point our vision could adapt, which is actually kind of cool. And so this is what that person did. And then after a week or so, I think he was able to adapt fully and be able to like drink his coffee and tie his shoes. And then he's able to adjust backwards after he took off the goggles. Okay, this is the one where it's a mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. So this whole idea was called perceptual set. So this is a bias or readiness. So this is not the same thing as mental set, which we'll get to in our another review. So perceptual set is when I prime you guys, or if I am talking about, let's say I'm talking about I think there's an example in here. What was the example? Okay, yeah, here we go. So if I was talking about whatchamacallit, like if I people playing instruments, or I was talking about faces, it would then set you up to answer one way or the other. So for this one versus this one, so this person obviously is playing the instrument, and then this lady is a face. But if I give you an ambiguous image, the question would be, well, which one would you be more likely to say this image is? So those of you that I have set up to talk about instruments and people playing instruments, you might say, oh, it's a guy playing, an instrument. If I was talking to you about facial features and eyes and hair and our mouths, then you might see this image and go, oh, it's a woman's face. So it's basically setting you up to perceive something in one way or another. A mental set is basically using ways that have worked for us in the past, but that sometimes can lead to error. For example, my procrastinators. I know some of you guys are wonderful at it and you do really well, but the one time that it doesn't work, then that can be detrimental to your grade or to your lifestyle. So that would be a mental set. Okay, remember this one? This was also a perceptual set. It was basically saying, have you guys shout this out? This was funny. You guys had to say folk, croak, soak, and then what do you call the white of an egg? A lot of people yelled out yolk, even though it's egg white, because we perceptually set you up to answer in a different way. Okay, then we have schemas. We know schemas are mental sets of how we perceive the world. This was context effects. Depending on the context, it would then change the way we view something. So this image isn't the best image, but because of the context, because the rabbits are on the outside, the question is the magician's cabinet, is the cabinet on the floor or is it hanging from the ceiling? So since it's giving us a context that the rabbits are on the outside, we're going to probably perceive this box as sitting on the floor. This one is the rabbits are being perceived as looking like downwards, like, oh my goodness, like what's down there? So we're supposed to perceive this one as if it was hanging on top. So again, context effects matter. It can change, context can change our perception of things. Okay, culture context, again, we talked about this. The whole idea was, what in the world is this thing? Is it a window? Is it a box? Is it a book? What is it? So even this thing here, so for some of us, most of us have windows in our homes. And so for a lot of us, we're going to perceive this as a window. That makes sense because our cultural context is to have windows in every room, or ideally like in every home. People that don't have windows in their homes might perceive this as a box or a metal something or a book because maybe they carry things on their heads and that's their culture. So our culture can really change the way we view things. Okay, and then this one, remember the fancy stove? So we want things that are going to appeal to our simple mind. Not that we're simple, but like we like things that are simple. So this whole idea was called human factors. And so those of you that have the nice fancy stove, it's great because this literally each knob goes with each stove. And so it's a quick thing whenever you're cooking. Whereas this one, this is a stove that I have every time. I cook every day. Every day I still have to like bend down and I have to look to figure out, like which one. Like even the other day I was like talking to my husband, we were cooking together and I was like, oh my gosh, honey, like why isn't the fire like turning on? And I kept like turning it on. He's like, because you're turning on the back one and not the front one. I was like, oh, duh, sorry. And so we ideally would want the fancy stove because it's appealing to human factors. It's why Apple products are really popular because they're easy and they're simple and they're easy to navigate. Okay. And then extrasensory perception is perception without sensory input, which is called ESP. All the different types of ESP are right here. Okay, so telepathy is mind to mind. So like you and I can be reading our minds to each other right now. Clairvoyance is a perception that I anticipate something as bad is currently happening. Like, oh my gosh, my friend in Anaheim is upset right now. Like I need to call her. Whereas precognition is me perceiving future events like, oh my gosh, tomorrow, everyone, be careful because X, Y, and Z is going to happen. And so it's interesting because this whole COVID-19, I'm curious to see if there were anybody out in the world that was like, oh, I can tell the future. I knew the world was going to shut down for X amount of time in March. It's like, no, nobody can do that. So that is ESP. Okay, so that is going to be your perception review. Hopefully you guys can familiarize yourselves with sensation and perception because I really think it's going to probably be on the test. I know I say that all the time, but hopefully you're able to see this in your real lives because the more we can apply it to our own lives, the more we're able to have the vocab stick. Alrighty, guys, have a wonderful day.